Welcome, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started while folks are still joining. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to our Burgut Expert Talk on Central Asia in the Energy Transition. I'm Laura Linderman, Director of Programs at Central Asia-Caucasus Institute, located at American Foreign Policy Council in Washington. This series is a collaboration between the Times of Central Asia and the American Foreign Policy Council Central Asia-Caucasus Institute. We're delighted to have you join us today. The global energy landscape is in a state of flux. The United States, Europe, and the United Nations are championing a move from fossil fuels to renewables. Yet the transition is proving to be complex and multifaceted. In this dynamic environment, Central Asia holds a pivotal position. The region's abundant resources, oil, gas, uranium, and even the potential for green hydrogen are poised to be critical for both Europe and the global energy security in the years ahead. This is especially relevant as Europe grapples with the need to diversify its energy sources. Today, we will have the privilege of hearing from two leading experts on the topic, Dr. Svante Cornell and Dr. Brenda Shaffer. They'll be presenting their insights based on their paper, Central Asia in the Energy Transition. Dr. Brenda Shaffer is a faculty member at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. She also holds prominent positions as a senior advisor for energy at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. She's coming to us from Tel Aviv, and Dr. Svante Cornell is the director of Central Asia-Caucasus Institute and is based in Stockholm. So just a few notes for how the webinar will go. After the speakers will give us somewhat of an overview of their paper, we'll open the floor for questions. Please use the Q&A button on the Zoom webinar screen if you'd like to ask questions live. We'd also like to let you know that this discussion is being recorded and will be published afterwards. And in general, if you're interested in events like this or our work, we invite you to join our Substack, the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute Substack, or follow us on Twitter, Blue Sky, or Facebook. So with that introduction completed, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Shaffer and Dr. Cornell.
Dr. Shaffer, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, today's seminar is called Central Asia and the Energy Transition, but I think I'd like to break apart those terms and discuss first the idea, are we really in an energy transition? Because if you, any journalists, any thought movers, most think tanks, most officials in Europe, EU, International Energy Agency, they present the energy transition with a capital T as if it's a fact. And I think the reality is that we're under the illusion of an energy transition, or we're under the assumption of an energy transition, but there's really nothing that's emerged that shows us signs of an energy transition or an imminent energy transition. For instance, from the mid-70s, we've been throwing literally trillions of dollars of subsidies on wind and solar. And today, and if in the 70s fossil fuels were about 85% of global energy consumption, today they're 81.5%. A lot of what's considered renewable energy isn't wind and solar, geothermal, hydropower, but it's actually something we're going to talk about maybe in detail today, but it's actually traditional energy, traditional renewable energy, which is burning of dung, biomass, and other biomass, lump coal, wood. So not exactly something that is futuristic, and certainly not something that's healthy, clean. Definitely one of the biggest, sources of pollution is actually indoor pollution through using and burning biomass and wood and dung in homes for heating, and I think we'll discuss that a little bit later. So I think if there was an energy transition taking place, and all the ideas about, well, is Kazakhstan's oil export going to become a stranded asset? Should Central Asians start to import or produce more natural gas if we're truly going to a non-fossil fuel era? I believe there's absolutely no evidence that we're in an energy transition, and therefore, if at all, Central Asian producers, especially since they're national oil companies, as most of the oil and gas producers in the region and the wider region are national companies. They're going to be much more successful than the general commercial oil and gas majors in the world, because they won't have the kind of public pressure against production of fossil fuels. They'll be able to continue to produce them. They'll sort of be left standing when other producers, maybe because of public pressure or legislation, aren't allowed, to operate it and produce. So we will have like a Kazmunai gas or a SOCAR in Azerbaijan, left standing, an ADNOC in the UAE, when let's say some of the majors will have lost investment or been limited by their governments from production. And then why isn't an energy transition taking place? I mean, with all this support and all these subsidies, and the reality is that today's generation of renewable energy, one, is not very energy dense, which means that you need a lot of land space or has a lot of weight to have equivalent amounts of energy, like the very nicely packed or densely packed packages of fossil fuels. And second, today's generation of renewable energy, which runs, let's say, for instance, wind, solar, hydropower, geothermal, it needs to run on a base load of fossil fuels. So it doesn't replace fossil fuels. It works hand in hand with fossil fuels. And especially Central Asia, which has a very cold climate. Kazakhstan is one of the coldest climates in the world, six-month length of winter. They can't think about when today's renewables providing the type of heat, reliable heat that they need for so many months of the year in Central Asia. We're a place where if you don't have heat, you don't just add another sweater, but it could mean life or death. I think I'll stop here, and we can expand a little later.
Great. Thank you so much. Actually, I do just have a question based on that, Brenda, and tell me if it's too specific, but you were explaining really clearly how renewables need a base load of fossil fuels. And so that, to me, indicates that Europe's going to want Central Asia's oil and gas anyway, but it's logistically challenging to get it there. What would you say are the roadblocks to that issue, and are there any workarounds there? I don't know if it's specific.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's good. I mean, there's a big gap in Europe, and we're seeing it maybe in front of our eyes this week in Germany with the collapse, with the imminent collapse of the government there, and elections basically on economic management. That a huge disconnect between what they want to be and what they are. So Europe would love to be in this energy transition and everything renewable energy and leading the world and all creating these new green jobs, but it's completely disconnected from reality. And I think most people, and probably most people listening here, most people, they think somehow wind and solar, okay, instead of, I don't know how electricity is. Some people even think, and it's even interesting, there's a recent report of the International Energy Agency, the IEA, saying, that we're in the era of electricity. Well, electricity isn't an energy source. It's a product of energy. But most people somehow think you plug something in, and that's kind of where it stops for you, right? But to have stable electricity, you need a constant source of electricity. I mean, like even most of you can feel it in your homes when you have a little overload or a little fall of electricity. Then the whole system can collapse. Well, this also happens on a market scale or on a national scale, and you need that. Or for instance, we saw a couple days ago in the UK, 90% of UK electricity today was on wind. But that 90% day is dependent on that other 10% being there 24/7. So the question is, when is Europe going to face the reality and start to commission, more gas. The biggest impediment to diversification of gas into Europe, bringing in more supplies, whether it's from Azerbaijan or whether it's from Turkmenistan, or other from wider Central Asia, is actually Europe itself. There's actually not, once you have the southern gas corridor going from Azerbaijan, you already have the infrastructure into Europe. It's not that hard to bring something across the Caspian. But the real reason that this hasn't happened is that Europe has denied public finance for fossil fuels, including gas, and has made it very hard for companies to have long-term contracts there. So Europe is the biggest impediment to Europe receiving diversified sources of gas from the Caspian.
Thanks so much. That was very helpful to sort of situate us. Svante, I'll turn it to you to kind of give an overview of your thoughts.
Thank you. So building on Brenda's comments regarding the general situation with Europe's energy, this is where the nuclear element comes in. And obviously we know since the early 90s that Central Asia and the Caucasus have been producers of oil and gas. This was one of the major stories, at least from the American narrative, if you will, want to use that term, about the region in the 90s, and since the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline project and then the associated gas projects with that. The big American presence in Central Asia started with Chevron and with Exxon moving into Kazakhstan to help Kazakhstan develop and bring to market its oil. And obviously we had the failed attempt to build a Trans-Caspian pipeline bringing Turkmen gas to the European markets. But 2 out of 3 succeeded, you could say. What's happened in more recent years is a little bit under the radar, at least for most people. I think Central Asia has emerged as an absolutely central producer of uranium. And this obviously is very important in connection to the general discussion of Europe's and the world energy situation, I would say. Connecting to what Brenda said, I'm speaking to you from Sweden today, where in the last couple of days we had a huge spike in electricity prices because in Germany there is no wind and no sunshine. And then suddenly there is not enough production of electricity because Germany obviously closed down their nuclear power plants. And that affects the whole of Northern Europe, where suddenly there is not enough electricity production when there is no sun shining and no wind blowing. What's happening outside of Germany, and I would suspect very soon in Germany, the discussion on reopening nuclear power plants is probably going to be activated. But elsewhere in Europe, you see obviously a return of nuclear. The return of nuclear has already been happening in some countries. I would say some people never gave it up. But definitely there is, I think, a growing understanding, sometimes even in environmental circles, that without nuclear, the entire edifice of trying to do what they're trying to do in terms of reducing dependence on fossil fuels is completely unrealistic. Now, this is actually an interesting departure because, as we discussed in the paper, only a few years ago, you could find politicians that are so anti-nuclear that they would rather actually fire up fossil fuels and close down their nuclear reactors. You had that happening in Belgium when the Green Party was in power. But I think in general, you've seen the UN climate agencies and others have started accepting that without nuclear, none of this is going to work. And obviously in the European case, this is compounded by the dependence on Russian natural gas and the obvious efforts to stop buying Russian natural gas and Russia's concomitant efforts to reorient its export of natural gas eastward to China and Asia. So the question then is, well, what's going to happen in Europe? Now, the EU imports 97% of its uranium, which obviously means that if there's going to be not only a continuation, but an expansion of nuclear electricity generation in Europe, that uranium has to come from somewhere. And that's also an issue because we see that Europe is dependent on Russia for enriched uranium, not for the natural uranium. but for the uranium that is actually enriched in a way that you can use in nuclear power plants. And at the same time, you see a reduction of production in countries like Niger, where on top of everything, there was a military coup last year, which turned the country away from France, and explicitly the former colonial power, of course, and they indicated very clearly they were going to get rid of the French presence in their uranium sector and opening up to a Russian presence. So there's a lot of geopolitics, not only in Central Asia, but everywhere in the world related to this. The background for our interests here, obviously, is a massive increase in Central Asian uranium production in the past 2 decades. Kazakhstan was not one of the world's largest producers not that long ago, but has now emerged to produce over 40% of the world's natural uranium. Add to that Uzbekistan is in 5th place, I believe, at around 6% of the world's natural uranium. That means you basically have half of the world's uranium being produced in Central Asia. And to that, we should add that in Mongolia, just to the east, the companies are beginning to extract what is likely to be large resources of uranium that are largely untapped. Obviously, a lot of forces are interested in getting their hands on this uranium because it's not just Europe that is expanding in the nuclear field. The Russians and the Chinese are very much present. I'll get back to this in a moment. But if we look at the situation in Central Asia, we see, first of all, there are actually 2 important points. The first is the effort to sell uranium and how to sell that to world markets. And the second is that both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are interested in developing their own nuclear power plants. Uzbekistan has signed a deal with Russia to build a small modular nuclear power plant, whereas Kazakhstan is still in the process of deciding with whom it will partner to build its first nuclear power plant. And all of this explains, I think, the interest that is taken really by one major Western country, which is France, in the Central Asian uranium. We don't see this very much from any other powers. We don't see very much from the United States, although the US is buying uranium from Kazakhstan. But in terms of a political interest in Central Asia, we see France really taking the lead, with President Macron visiting both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan last year, after he had also visited Mongolia some months before. France's big uranium producer, Urano, owns a majority stake in one of the biggest uranium mines in Kazakhstan. It also has interests in Uzbekistan. And obviously, the political visit was intended to expand this Central Asian presence, this French presence in the uranium mining, but also to emphasize the French interest in being involved in the first nuclear power plant being built in Kazakhstan. Just last month, we saw President Tokayev of Kazakhstan making a reciprocal visit to Paris and indicating in an article he published in French press that France would be involved in one way or another in the Kazakh nuclear power plant. That was my interpretation, at least. Now, as I mentioned, it's not easy to just move in and, so to speak, take control of the sector, especially because the Russians and the Chinese are very much involved. And I think we will see for the foreseeable future, Russia and China continue to be involved. Rosatom being a partner in a number of mining ventures in Kazakhstan. Rosatom and Kazakhstan's Kazatomprom having cooperated very closely for many, many years in a variety of nuclear issues. We also see, obviously, the Chinese similarly moving in, sourcing 60% of their own imported uranium from Kazakhstan, securing access to a number of uranium mines, and also helping to build a nuclear fuel fabrication plant in Kazakhstan. So it would be foolish for any of us to expect that Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan would reduce their ties to Russia or China in the nuclear field, just as it would be in any other field. And that's not really the point, but the point is that just as part of their general policy of balanced foreign relations, these 2 countries, which are the 2 Central Asian leading countries, are strongly interested in having a diversity of foreign interest in their uranium and nuclear sector, just as has been the case in all others of their of the important areas of their foreign policy, be it in the oil and gas sector, be it in other sectors. And the question then is how can this be? What can be done in order to make sure that this is successful? And I think in many ways we face a situation that is very similar to the diplomatic situation in the 1990s, where it was all about oil and gas diplomacy, and countries like especially Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan made sure to award exploration contracts in tandem, in parallel to Western Russian, and in the case of Kazakhstan, also Chinese companies, in a manner that worked to support their sovereignty and their independence. And I think we're seeing the same thing happening in the nuclear and uranium field right now. And that is obviously the way the Western partners of the Central Asian states should see it. And so far, I think this is an area in which obviously the United States could become much more active in the future. I'll stop there for now, but glad to answer questions and delve into any of the other associated areas.
Great. Thanks so much, Svante. Just to push a little bit further on the question of uranium. So you highlighted sort of the geopolitical piece, the role of Niger and Russia, and sort of described that the main impediment, if I heard you correctly, was a political impediment on the side of attracting Western investment in uranium, was on one side. And then from the Central Asian perspective, how do you see them managing this geopolitical sort of conflagration between China, Russia, and the West, specifically as it relates to uranium? So what other challenges are there besides the political sphere from the Western viewpoint, if any?
Well, I would say that the transportation issue is an important one, and we can come back to that one in a moment. But I think we should see this as part and parcel, as I said, of the general foreign policy of the Central Asian states, which is that their interest, first and foremost, is to maximize both their political and their economic independence. And again, this is exactly a parallel to the situation with oil and gas in the 1990s. And we can see that the countries that were able to develop their oil and gas industry and to connect it to Western markets were the ones that were able to develop independent foreign policies that were not forced to toe the line of any of the larger neighbors. And I think now, as we look towards the future, the issue of how the Central Asian uranium is extracted and how it's being brought to market is going to be equally important. And there, a political commitment, a political presence of Western powers is immensely helpful for the Central Asians in order to build their economic independence also in this field. On the transportation issue, I'm sure Brenda would be able to add to this. The main question is the diversification of supply routes, where obviously for Kazakhstan, the large majority of its shipments of uranium, as is the case, by the way, for oil, goes through Russia, but that there is a clear intent to diversify. The president gave an instruction to his government to diversify as far as oil was concerned, and in general, as far as Kazakhstan's links to the world markets was concerned, after Russia put artificial impediments on the export of Kazakh oil through Russia just 2 years ago. And we see since then a significant increase in the attempts and successful attempts to export natural uranium through the Caspian corridor across to Azerbaijan. But obviously, we're talking still about only 10% of Kazakh uranium, whereas obviously still a lot of the enrichment takes place in Russia. And that is a situation that we should definitely monitor.
Great. Thanks so much, Svante. Brenda, could you maybe discuss sort of go a bit deeper on the transportation piece, just to sort of follow on to Svante?
Well, I think, one of the basic elements that's always affected economics, transportation, and foreign policy of the states of Central Asia is the fact that they're landlocked. So we think all countries are equal, everyone should have the same rights, but the reality is that landlocked countries need permission of their neighbors to move goods for flights, for any form of transportation. So it makes it inherently geopolitical. And I think that's what, as Svante discussed, the energy strategies in the over the past 2.5 decades of the successful countries in the region were ones that did have multi-directional, multi-vector energy export, and looking for something similar in their uranium export. And I think that that's very indicative of landlocked countries that can't develop a dependence on any, in any neighboring state.
Great, thanks so much. So let's talk a little bit about Central Asia's energy needs internally, because we hear a lot about that piece. And then we're also describing here how they have the potential to be an energy exporter, although there are significant challenges. So can you maybe talk a little bit about how to think about the competing demands?
Right. So, I mean, Central Asia, I think mostly from the world, they look at Central Asia as a source of exports, and very few people are looking at the needs of the region themselves. But with the last few years, the extensive economic growth that's taken place in Central Asia needs gas, not only oil and gas for export, but also it needs additional gas in the domestic market. And and probably the most likely candidate for as a gas buyer of Central Asian gas is Central Asia. So we're already seeing recently Uzbekistan increased exports from Gazprom. These gas exports go through Kazakhstan into Uzbekistan, but Kazakhstan didn't offtake gas, didn't have any gas import contract. We have still the tremendous riches of Turkmenistan that, for years, Turkmenistan, major export to China. For years, Turkmenistan's been looking at export to Europe, but actually also there are some signs that there could be more or establishment of export within the region itself. And that, I think, would also go hand in hand with sort of the greater regional cohesion, trade, contact that's been happening in Central Asia. Some of it just the region, but also in the last couple of years, sort of a really major development is the strategic cooperation between Turkey, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. That's really in the security realm, defense realm. And this I think, is making it more likely that also there will be more energy trade within the region. Also, I think we're going to have more energy investments within the region. So let's say a company like SOCAR in Azerbaijan, has been looking at the Central Asian gas market. So not just investments in Europe or abroad, but in the region, not just looking for investors from the West, but also, from the region itself. I think something that's really overlooked, and only when we were researching this project did I become clear to me how extensive this problem was, is that we have a really unique situation in that, Central Asian countries, all of them are ranked with either highest level or high level of human development by the UN indexes. Yet there are huge pockets, or maybe more than pockets, maybe regions of Kazakhstan that still use solid fuels in residential settings. And so if any of you, like for instance, in parts of Astana, even if you've been in the winter and you go by a certain region, certain neighborhoods, and you literally smell the smoke from the apartment buildings. 30% of households in Kazakhstan still use solid fuels, burning at home, not at a power plant, not at an industrial site, but at home. About half of Kyrgyzstan heats in the winter from the same type of stoves. And these are around the world, whether it's very prevalent in Africa, parts of China, all over the world. This is one of the biggest threats to human health, is actually the indoor pollution. So we tend to think about factories as being the danger. The real danger is actually, and especially to women and children, that the home stove, where lump coal or dung or wood or other biomass is burnt, and that the children and women and children that are usually at home the most hours are breathing this, on a 24/7, or at least in the winter 24/7, and this is a huge source of lowering life expectancy, respiratory diseases, problems for sight. And I think so many people in the West, when they think of, we got to get off of fossil fuels, they don't even understand that there certainly is something much worse than fossil fuels, and that's the home stove, the indoor pollution. And for many, even in Kazakhstan, as we were looking at the data here, even in places where there is gas and electricity, it's not just a problem of getting the infrastructure there, getting the gas volumes there, but there are places where they could turn on the switch, but they can't afford to turn on the switch. And so they'll still go literally take a lump of coal from some kind of open mine, or from their family member who's a miner, and burn that at home. Or take some animal dung and burn that at home, versus turning on the switch because of price. So we need a plan that not only provides clean energy like natural gas or electricity, or the product of fossil fuels of electricity, but also makes it affordable for at least all the populations in Central Asia. And it's a really big problem, and again, something that developing countries can't imagine. I used to ask students over the years, maybe ask people in our audience, have you ever been as a tourist or lived in a place that doesn't have regular access to electricity? I'm not saying that it had a blackout, right? But I'm saying a place where basically you don't have electricity. And what you notice, I've spent a lot of time in Tanzania, which is a country I love, but also with people, with whole villages where there's no regular, electricity access. And what you notice is just smoke. I mean, literally smoke from people's homes, and it's more dangerous than, any habits of smoking, or and it's again afflicting mostly women and children that spend more hours in the home. So it's a developing world problem. Even though the countries of Central Asia are quite well developed, they still have this legacy challenge.
So interesting and quite important to sort of make that point about where fossil fuels are the bridge between moving in from coal, etc., to a renewable future. So as you mentioned, I think earlier, Brenda, their institutions like the World Bank are hesitant to fund fossil fuel projects, and that is one of the impediments. What do you see as a way, or what would you recommend policymakers and or these big institutions as a way to kind of help this in this intermediate period, if I'm understanding correctly from
right? Okay. I mean, when I take issue with, I don't think it's an intermediate period, but let's say the intermediate goal of renewables. But
okay,
that World Bank and all the cooperative developing banks, the G7, the EU, the European Connected Development Banks, stopped public finance for all fossil fuels. So that's like a really feel good moment. Wow, we don't finance fossil fuels, but in the Western countries, they don't need public finance. They have companies. If you need a power plant in Kentucky or in Maine, if there's a market for it, private capital will go in. This only affects the world's poorest. And so what you're saying, and again, I think there's this huge disconnect between the World Bank, the G7, Europe, especially Europe, International Energy Agency, that for people who, if you don't give them public finance for natural gas power, let's say either heat or electricity, they're not going to say, okay, then I'm going to get a wind, we're going to get wind power for Kizilorda or Karaganda in the winter, right? Something that's useless, as we're seeing even in Germany right now, how useless the wind and solar is in most of the winter, but in places with much more severe winters, right? What it means is you're condemning them to this indoor pollution. And I think, it's funny, like the climate camp always has kind of like the moral authority. They're the good people thinking about the future, thinking green, right? But I think it's quite immoral to leave people with the indoor pollution. Again, if you haven't seen it with your eyes, what it looks like, maybe it's hard to imagine what a difficult situation that is for families, for people. But what can they do? I mean, they have started in 2019, the EU and the European Development Banks, I believe 2020 already the World Bank, but G7 in 2021, they stopped almost all funding, public finance for fossil fuels. Hopefully that will end. And again, even from a moral perspective, like it's really, you can't ask, when most of the West uses primarily fossil fuels, you can't say we're going to use them, but you're not going to have them.
Sure. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, to pivot to LNG. In the paper, you mentioned that the U.S. might be an unreliable supplier of LNG to Europe, especially based on the policy shifts of the incoming administration. So, can you talk about what this means for Central Asia? What does this mean for Europe? Yeah, what does it mean for geopolitics?
Right. So in January 2024, the Biden administration canceled new permits for LNG exports for countries that don't have favored nation trade agreements with the United States. So this meant for a lot of even U.S. allies in Europe and in Asia that, because with gas, you really, you plan for it. You don't just suddenly, okay, well, we'll see next year where we'll buy from. Generally before you're going to build more power plants on gas, you're going to want to know that it's going to be likely that you have accessible and affordable gas. And this was like a real sort of cold shower for many countries, and they immediately pivoted and looked for other LNG suppliers. Qatar and Oman especially benefited from this with a lot of new contracts, especially for countries in Asia. But I'm assumed that almost on day one, the Trump administration will cancel this prohibition. But I think the damage has already been done because you can't buy LNG on the basis of every 4 years the conditions changing. And I think there's been a huge damage to the U.S. as an LNG exporter. And then, yes, I think that will mean that the countries that need gas, we're going to be looking more for pipeline gas, where it's to dedicated markets. And this is with the proximity between Central Asia and Europe. This suddenly will be of more interest under the condition that the U.S. might every 4 years change its gas export policy.
Great, thank you. So, in a lot of times in discussions like this, and me as a novice, I can ask the dumb questions. We hear this idea about a green energy corridor from Central Asia to Europe. Can you explain what this means? What are the technological and political hurdles, and what are people really talking about?
Right. So again, we have a lot of aspirations and then, reality. Azerbaijan's been increasing its production of, I'll go back to something that today's generation of renewable energy, wind, solar, geothermal, hydropower, a lot of it depends on specific geographic conditions. Like you can't just suddenly, well, if you're Germany, say, oh, I want to have a great, solar around the year solar production. You don't have the conditions. It doesn't matter how supportive you are. There is a reality. So like the same. So actually, Azerbaijan, despite all its oil and gas, has very good conditions for wind, solar, and geothermal. So it's been investing a lot in recent years in increasing its renewable capacity. Some of this is just starting to come online, and this is freeing up natural gas for export to Europe. Let's say that instead of using it in the domestic market. Now, you could Azerbaijan is interested together with Georgia, Turkey, to cross the Black Sea and then into Romania, Bulgaria, maybe onward into Hungary, Serbia, to export renewable energy. But you could probably a cheaper and safer way is to do it sort of in a virtual sense, in that, like, for instance, electricity buyers in Europe buy electricity from power plants in Azerbaijan that are producing solar, wind, and other things. They help to produce that electricity, but actually will be consumed in Azerbaijan. And instead of exporting electricity, you export gas that would have been used in Azerbaijan. So it's a way of increasing renewable production, but without the waste of the energy, because when electricity is transmitted long distances, it loses a lot of the power. Other things can happen in the region too. For instance, across the Caspian, the same kind of thing, increasing renewable production in Central Asia, but instead, using it domestically, but exporting gas across the Caspian instead. So you have this a lot in Europe, which is kind of virtual gas trading, where let's say more LNG is imported into Italy and France's LNG ports because they're on the Mediterranean, they can have access. And then countries like Germany can take more Russian gas. But in a sense, they paid for the LNG, and they brought that Italy didn't need, and instead they take their pipeline gas. So we have a lot of these virtual trades in energy, and I think there could be a lot of creative solutions for this.
Can I add a quick point here?
Yeah, please do.
I think one point I'd like to mention is how we've seen this from the announcement of the trilateral cooperation of Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, with this idea of building immense amounts of generating immense amounts of electricity from solar mainly, and to some extent wind, and to export that. Whether or not that's realistic, and I think Brenda has raised serious issues about, if this is even the smartest thing to do. I think what it does speak to is the growing cooperation between the countries in the region. We've seen this obviously first with the Central Asian Presidents meeting. Now they're always including the president of Azerbaijan in their meetings. But we see specific, bilateral nodes, if you will, developing. For a long time, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, partly because of oil and gas cooperation, had already developed a strongly developed partnership. Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan began developing it, and very fast during the last 2 years we saw a racing development of the Uzbek-Azerbaijani bilateral relationship in all areas, including defense and defense industry. And now we see this trilateral one. So I think to me, it's somebody who's originally from Europe, it reminded me a bit of the emergence of European cooperation, in the sense that we talked about coal and steel in Europe, but in Central Asia and the Caucasus, it's about energy. But this is a way in which the export part is what caught the headlines. But I think more importantly for me, is that the three countries are trying to integrate their power grids, which, especially when you have certain countries, let's say if this happens across the region, certain countries have a lot of water resources, others have a lot of natural gas, some will have nuclear power, others will have the money to invest in whatever solar parks and other renewable energy. This will make the region as a whole much more resilient in terms of its own energy, and in terms of having these countries cooperate with each other to avoid situations where one or another country may be left at the whims of great powers.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So did you have something to add, Brenda, to that?
Or... No, I completely concur.
Okay, great. So I'd like to remind the audience that if they have questions, please go ahead and submit that via the Q&A button on the Zoom, and we'd be happy to take your questions. I guess I'd like to ask you both, at the end of your paper, you sort of have a conclusion of seeing these big energy shifts in the global energy landscape, and that therefore leads to Central Asia's increasing importance in global energy politics. So what particular policy recommendations would you offer to Western governments, and what would you offer to Central Asian leaders to sort of maximize the potential benefits, mitigate the risks, and sort of better understand this sort of evolving and changing energy landscape? So predict the future for me also.
If I should start, I would say that especially having looked into the nuclear side of things, it seems very clear to me, at least, that what's important for the Central Asian region and for the Central Asia-Caucasus region more broadly is to rise to climb the ladder, if you will. In other words, it's good to be a producer of raw materials. It's better to be a producer of refined materials. It's true in, you see Azerbaijan and the petrochemical industry there and so forth, and in Kazakhstan as well. But obviously, in the nuclear field, it's good to be a producer of 40% of the world's uranium. It would be even better if Kazakhstan were able to develop its indigenous nuclear industry so that it can prepare the whole vertically integrate, in other words, to prepare the materials like pellets that are used in nuclear power plants. Now, obviously, this is something that requires large investments. But I would note that Kazakhstan has, serious experience in the nuclear field. This is not just a country that happens to have a lot of nuclear mines or uranium mines. This is a country that hosts the low enriched uranium bank for the international community. This is a country that has a developed nuclear industry and research as well in the nuclear field. And I think this is a country that could definitely move up the ladder. And that obviously would be in the interest of the Western and other partners to Kazakhstan that would be able to not necessarily have either a third country involved in the transactions for the uranium that they need for their nuclear power plants, but that could help also Kazakhstan develop its role in the global nuclear industry. To me, it seems that that's the area in which the most could be done to partner with and to help Kazakhstan, and also obviously Uzbekistan and down the road Mongolia in this regard, to help them away from the situation of simply being producers of raw material.
Thank you, Brenda.
Picking up on the theme of regional cooperation. So in the Soviet period, the gas flows weren't really conducive to regional cooperation within Central Asia and across the Caspian into the South Caucasus. So Turkmen gas went to Russia. Parts of Kazakhstan gas went to Uzbekistan, and other parts of Uzbekistani gas went to Kazakhstan, and that created actually more of not a healthy dependence between the countries. But now we're in a situation where, with the independence of the countries and the good sort of increased cooperation between the countries, and like I said, potential investments from within the greater region, from Azerbaijan, maybe from Turkey, into the Central Asian gas market. I think we can see a lot more different gas flows, and ones that are actually, open, like take advantage of the cooperation between the countries to very rational gas flow. So to look at regional cooperation on gas, and then from the outside, as you asked, for international both investors, but more on the public finance side, to change their policies and to approve natural gas. If they have a problem, if they really have such a frustration with natural gas, then to say in areas where, as Svante used the phrase, climbing up the nuclear ladder, where they're climbing up the energy ladder from indoor pollution to power plants, still natural gas with lower health threats, lower air pollution, and lower carbon emissions. So it's still a much better idea than the indoor pollution. So they should think about natural gas. And then also, we're going to have maybe some major earthquakes. I hope not physical earthquakes, but geopolitical earthquakes in and around the region soon. Probably a winding down of the Russia-Ukraine war. Who knows next in Iran? Potentially big. We're having right now. Iran itself sits on the second largest reserves of natural gas in the world, and it's closing down schools, public buildings over the last week because they can't keep the lights on and keep the heat going. So this also teaches you can be very rich in energy resources and have very poor energy policies, but there's a lot of geopolitical earthquakes that may happen in the region, and this will affect both opportunities and create threats to Central Asia, including in the energy sphere.
Thank you so much. So to leave you both with one last opportunity to speak, I have two questions for each of you. Number one, what did we not touch on that you'd like to maybe mention from the paper, or just in general, that you think the audience might want to think about and related to Central Asian energy politics? And number two, if you were going to distill, this is a paper we've covered a wide-ranging sort of the complexities of the topic. If you were going to distill this down to something you really want to leave the audience with in sort of a short, pithy sentence or two, what would you really like to highlight? So Svante, I'll send it over to you first.
The one thing I think we may not have touched upon here is the opportunities that exist for this long-standing project of trying to get Central Asian gas exported in a Western direction. This was, this was an issue in the 90s when first this Argentinian company Brenda and then you and Cal were involved in the project of, talking to the Taliban and getting a pipeline through Afghanistan to the south into India, Pakistan. Then there were efforts by others to build a Trans-Caspian pipeline going to the west. For the regional countries, the big problem was always that the threats from the big northern neighbor. What would happen if these countries actively attempted to bridge the Caspian in terms of large-scale infrastructure that would carry large amounts of energy? That seems to be an issue that's changing because as Russia is more interested in exporting to the east, they might see Turkmen gas flowing to China as a bigger problem than Turkmen gas flowing to Europe. And that, if that's the new reality, we have to see if that holds. We're stuck with a situation in which, we have this fatigue, the fatigue of talking about Trans-Caspian pipelines for years and years and years and years, and it never happens and people give up on it. Whereas you may now have a completely new situation where this is that there's a completely different geopolitical possibility of making this happen. Whereas people have this fatigue of not really wanted to interact with Turkmenistan because working with Turkmenistan has its own challenges, and also because they think that this is just never going to happen. So I think that is something that is very important. Connected to that, I would say, is the fact that we have a great Western interest to some degree in Central Asia, but we are still completely misreading and actually we're actually undermining our own interest in the South Caucasus, and doing so by failing to interact with the strongest power, the middle power that exists in South Caucasus, which is Azerbaijan. And if you look at the United States and France, there is instead this attempt to beef up Armenia with a variety of security and military affairs, instead of trying to actively work for finalizing a solution to this conflict and developing infrastructure that would be able to cross the South Caucasus, linking the Caspian Sea and Turkey.
Thanks so much, Brenda.
2 points. So in the most important geographic or geopolitical divide right now of the US and its allies versus the axis of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Central Asia and the Caucasus sits as the buffer zone or the neighboring zone between these two blocks. And its importance is, if it's always had importance, but if its importance is more, it's higher than we've seen in the past, as you could say, either straddlers or neighbors to these two big blocks. And nothing could have been more illustrative of the importance of the region than the different nights when Iran and Israel exchanged missile fire, and all international flights, either went to south of Iran and Israel, but most of them went from flights from Europe to Asia, went over Turkey, Georgia, Azerbaijan, across the Caspian, Turkmenistan, across northern Central Asia. And it just illustrated the geopolitical significance of Central Asia and the Caucasus in keeping these countries at friendly and open, stable, and trading with the West. And a lot of, like I said, that next to the region, the Central Asia and the Caucasus are really islands of stability, with all the things that are going on in Georgia and that have gone on between Azerbaijan and Armenia, are really islands of tranquility. When we say that, right next door what's happening in Iran, the huge change in Syria, which maybe Syria seems, well, what's that to do with Central Asia? But it's been a huge geopolitical shift for Turkey. It's been clear that Turkey is now the main power in the northern part of the Middle East, to the detriment of Iran, to the detriment of Iranian proxies, and even to Russia and to the United States. It's clear that the power now in the northern part of the Middle East is Turkey, and Turkey has these alliances with Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. So I think it also enhances the importance of the region. So that would be on the big shifts. On the little sentences, pithy, I would say if you have no gas, you're going to have dung. So you're not going to have wind towers, you're not going to have solar panels, you're going to have dung. So it's better to have gas.
That's a great way to end. If you don't so that we'll definitely pull that out.
Okay.
So I wanted to go ahead and thank you, Dr. Brenda Shaffer, Dr. Svante Cornell, for your time. This was a great and wide-ranging discussion. On behalf of Central Asia-Caucasus Institute at the American Foreign Policy Council, I wanted to thank Times of Central Asia for this wonderful Burgut Expert Talk series that we have. We've recorded this event and it will be available on our YouTube channel, Central Asia-Caucasus Institute as well, for the latest analysis, copies of our videos, and geopolitical thoughts from folks here in Washington and in Europe. So thank you again for this really provocative event, and I hope to see the audience next time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.